All too often, official inquiries are conducted by the very people who should themselves be under investigation. In this respect, Britain's Chilcot inquiry on the Iraq War bears a distressing similarity to the 911 Commission. In a remarkable symmetry, both inquiries involved a Jewish Zionist historian who not only advised his country's leaders to go to war against Iraq, but actually provided the ideological justification for that unnecessary war. Perhaps Philip Zelikow was one of the few people who was not surprised by his appointment as Executive Director of the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks upon the United States, better known as the 911 Commission. After all, the professor of history at the University of Virginia had shown uncanny prescience in foreseeing an event such as 911 itself. In 1998, as project director for the Catastrophic Terrorism Group, Zelikow had written, "An act of catastrophic terrorism that killed thousands or tens of thousands of people would be a watershed event in America's history. Like Pearl Harbor, such an event would divide our past and future into a before and after." Yet despite his awareness of an imminent threat of catastrophic terrorism against the United States, in the Bush administration, Zelikow was instrumental in downgrading the status of the National Coordinator for Counterterrorism, Richard Clarke.
Zelikow had worked on the 2001 transition team for President Bush as the transition team's advisor on counterterrorism issues at the National Security Council, Dick Clarke's operation, and that it was Philip Zelikow who had essentially urged that Dick Clarke be demoted, that he be barred from having easy access to the Oval Office. Richard Clarke had been President Clinton's counterterrorism advisor and had very easy access to the White House. He could essentially go in and see the president whenever he thought there was an urgent threat that needed to be acted on. At Zelikow's urging in 2001, Dick Clarke suddenly finds himself blocked from access to the Oval Office. He couldn't get to the president to tell him that there was a big threat that needed to be acted on. So the guy who's running the investigation of 9/11 is the guy who put in place the machinery at the White House in 2001 that prevented the National Security Council from really doing its job on terrorism.
In an even clearer conflict of interest, as a member of Bush's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, Zelikow had authored the 2002 National Security Strategy of the United States.
Condoleezza Rice contacts Zelikow at the University of Virginia and asks him to prepare a document for the White House that would justify a preemptive war, an attack against an enemy that did not necessarily pose an immediate threat to the United States. In many ways, it would be a document that would turn American military doctrine on its head. Zelikow does this and produces quite a masterfully written a memo that's called the National Security Strategy of the United States, issued in September in 2002. And very few people know that this document was written by Philip Zelikow of the University of Virginia. That really wouldn't be well known for another 2 years.
Dubbed the Bush Doctrine by the Washington Post's hawkishly pro-Israeli columnist Charles Krauthammer, it advocated the necessity of preemptive war. Based on a policy first mooted in 1992 by two other Jewish neoconservatives, Paul Wolfowitz and Louis Libby, the Zelikow Doctrine provided the justification for the 2003 invasion of Iraq. While Bush probably believed he was ridding the world of evil, Zelikow knew exactly why Iraq was being targeted. In a rare moment of candor, he told an audience at the University of Virginia on September 10, 2002, "Why would Iraq attack America or use nuclear weapons against us? I'll tell you what I think the real threat is, and actually has been since 1990. It's the threat against Israel. And this is the threat that dare not speak its name, because the Europeans don't care deeply about that threat, I will tell you frankly. And the American government doesn't want to lean too hard on it rhetorically because it's not a popular sell." Nevertheless, as Executive Director of the 911 Commission, Zelikow did his very best to sell the Iraq War to the American people. The first expert witness he called had no special expertise on the events of September 11, but that didn't seem to matter too much. Instead of discussing 9/11, Abraham Sofer, a board member of the pro-Israeli Koret Foundation, made an impassioned speech in support of the preemptive war against Iraq. An even more controversial expert witness called was Laurie Mulroy, known as the neocons' favorite conspiracy theorist. The American Enterprise Institute scholar had made a career out of seeing the hand of Saddam Hussein behind every anti-American terrorist attack during the previous decade. Exercising a skepticism towards Mulroy's batty theories, lacking in much of the media coverage, one of the 9/11 widows lambasted Zelikow for this transparent sales pitch for the Iraq War. Zelikow's persistent efforts to rewrite the Commission staff's reports to give the impression of a link between al-Qaeda and Iraq horrified some of his staff, many of whom considered him a White House mole. Little did they suspect, however, that Zelikow's loyalties might lie much further afield. If British Prime Minister Gordon Brown were genuinely interested in finding out why his predecessor followed George Bush into the Iraq quagmire, his appointment of Sir Lawrence Freedman to the 5-member Chilcot inquiry was an odd choice.
Tomorrow, Tony Blair is scheduled to appear before the Chilcot inquiry into Iraq, but today the inquiry itself was making the news. You may not have noticed, but 2 members of the panel are Jewish. Does that matter? Well, a couple of commentaries in newspapers have suggested that it might.
As the political editor of the BBC's Newsnight programme, Michael Crick pointed out, critics of the war might argue Sir Lawrence was himself one of the causes of the war. Crick was referring to a Freedman memo that formed the basis of Tony Blair's 1999 Chicago speech, The Doctrine of the International Community. In what became known as the Blair Doctrine, Freedman had offered an answer to the specious question, when was military action justified for liberal humanitarian reasons? In addition to the Freedman Doctrine's justification of military intervention in rogue states such as Iraq, Freedman has admitted that he instigated a pre-war seminar for the British Prime Minister because he was aware of misgivings among some specialists in Iraq about the direction of policy. Clearly, Freedman had no such misgivings himself about the illegal invasion of Iraq. He claims motivated by rather noble criteria. In his recent book, A Choice of Enemies, America Confronts the Middle East, Freedman is dismissive of those who suspect less noble motives for the war. Another popular theory, he writes, is that U.S. foreign policy was effectively hijacked by a group of neoconservatives with a grand design to reshape the Middle East. A conspiratorial version of this theory argues that the aim was to help Israel by removing a leading rejectionist state from the scene. Presumably, the consistency of the prescriptions that runs from Oded Yinon's A Strategy for Israel in the 1980s through Pearl, Feith, and Worms's A Clean Break to the so-called Bush Doctrine is merely coincidental. Evidently, the learned professor of war studies needs to read The Israeli Origins of the Middle East War Agenda in Stephen Snigoski's The Transparent Cabal. Perhaps it is also conspiratorial, or worse, to wonder about the media's hyping a book which obscures why America confronts Israel's enemies in the Middle East, while one which exposes the Zionist agenda gets the silent treatment. But it certainly is cause for concern when Freedman's book, which also opts for the euphemism of a security fence to describe Israel's apartheid wall and repeatedly refers to the illegally occupied West Bank as Judea and Samaria, is given such credence. Just as the Zelikow-directed 911 Commission suppressed evidence that the main motive for the September 11 attacks was American support for Israel, Freedman's presence on the Chilcot inquiry is a clear indication that there will be no inquiry into the role of Zionist insiders in taking Britain to war against Iraq, a country that posed a threat not to British interests but to Israel's regional hegemony.